The text came into the family group chat at 4:12 on a Thursday afternoon. A photo of a menu with little red circles drawn around 6 different entrees, and a caption from my mother that read, "Got everyone's steaks locked in for Sunday. Bryce is doing the tomahawk, Nora's doing the filet, the twins are splitting the ribeye for 2, Camden's doing the New York strip. So excited to spoil these babies." I read it standing in my kitchen with a dish towel over my shoulder, and I want to tell you that I noticed the omission immediately, with a kind of cold, physical clarity, the way you notice a missing stair in the dark before your foot actually finds the gap. 6 grandchildren in that family. 5 names circled on that menu. My son's name was not one of them. I didn't say anything in the group chat. I want to be honest about that, because I think the specifics matter more than the summary of how this story ends. I put my phone face down on the counter, finished drying the dish in my hand, and stood there for a long moment doing the kind of math I'd spent years doing without ever admitting to myself that I was doing it. Because this wasn't new. This was, I understood standing in that kitchen, simply the clearest, most expensive version yet of something that had been happening to my son for 3 years, ever since he'd turned 4, and the family had decided, without ever announcing it, exactly how much of him they were willing to make room for. I want you to understand something before I go any further, because I think it changes how you'll hear the rest of this story. I am not a person who goes looking for slights. I have spent most of my adult life doing the opposite, giving people the most generous possible reading of their behavior, assuming exhaustion over malice, assuming oversight over intention. I still believe, even now, that my parents are not cruel people, not in the way a stranger watching from outside this family might assume. But I've also learned, over 3 years of watching my son get quietly filed into a smaller category than his cousins, that 100 small oversights, stacked one on top of another, eventually stop being oversights and start being a decision, whether or not anyone in that family would ever call it that out loud. 2 weeks after that group chat photo, something happened that none of them saw coming, and I want to walk you through exactly how it happened, because I think the specifics matter more than the outcome. But first you need to understand who I am, who my son is, and exactly what it took to get to that Sunday dinner table with 6 place settings and 5 steaks. My name doesn't matter for the purposes of this story, so I'll just tell you what I do. I've spent the last 9 years working in restaurant operations, first as a floor manager for a regional steakhouse group, then, for the last 4 years, as a director of vendor relations for a hospitality company that supplies specialty proteins, dry-aged beef in particular, to a network of high-end restaurants across 3 states. It is not glamorous work in the way people assume when I tell them what I do. It involves relationships with ranchers and distributors, contract negotiations, quality control audits, and an intimate, granular understanding of exactly how a $120 steak gets from a feedlot to a white tablecloth. It is, in other words, precise work, the kind that trains you to notice exactly where value comes from and exactly who is quietly absorbing the cost of it. I am the older of 2 daughters. My sister, Whitney, is 4 years younger than me, and she married into money in the specific, comfortable way that people mean when they say that. Her husband, Grant, runs his family's commercial real estate business, and between the 2 of them, they live in a 6-bedroom house 40 minutes from my parents with a pool shaped like a kidney bean, and a housekeeper who comes twice a week. Whitney has 3 children. I have 1. My son, Eli, is 7 years old, quiet in the specific way some children are quiet, not from sadness but from a kind of careful, watchful attentiveness that I recognized in myself the first time I saw it in him, because I was exactly the same kind of child. I should tell you about Eli's father, because it matters for understanding the shape of my family's treatment of my son, even if it isn't really this story's main subject. Eli's father and I separated when Eli was 2, amicably enough that we still coordinate holidays without much friction, but the separation meant that for the first several years of Eli's life, it was just the 2 of us, no stepfather bringing a second household's resources into the picture, no blended family calendar doubling his birthday celebrations, just me, working full-time, raising a small, careful boy largely on my own, with my parents 30 minutes away, and I assumed, in his corner. I want to be precise about when the pattern actually started, because I think it's important to know it wasn't always this way. When Eli was a baby, my parents were, by any honest measure, engaged and affectionate grandparents. My mother came over every Wednesday to help with childcare, while I worked a half day. My father built him a small wooden rocking horse the winter he turned 1, the kind of thing you do for a grandchild you're genuinely delighted by. I don't think anyone in my family set out, at any specific moment, to treat my son as a lesser grandchild. I think, the same way it happens in a lot of families, it accumulated slowly, in 100 small comparisons nobody examined too closely, until the accumulation became its own kind of gravity. Whitney's oldest, Bryce, was born 18 months after Eli, and I remember, even then, noticing a subtle shift in the air of family gatherings, not hostility toward Eli, nothing so obvious as that, but a kind of magnetic pull toward Bryce that I told myself, for a long time, was simply the natural excitement of a second grandchild, a new baby, a fresh audience for everyone's attention. Then came the twins, Harper and Hudson, 2 years after that, and then Camden, Whitney's youngest, born the same spring Eli turned 5. By the time all 5 of my sisters and my combined children were old enough to be present at family functions together, a hierarchy had settled into place that nobody had ever announced, but that everybody, including Eli, seemed to understand without being told. I want to give you a few specific examples, because I think generalities are easy to dismiss and specifics are not. The Christmas Eli turned 4, my parents bought each of Whitney's 3 children a full outdoor playset item, a trampoline for Bryce, matching bicycles for the twins, while Eli received a single, perfectly nice but noticeably smaller gift, a set of building blocks that cost, I'd estimate, about 1/10 of what any one of his cousins received. I told myself that year that it was simply a budget consideration, that Whitney's kids happened to be at an age where bigger gifts made sense. I didn't say anything. I thanked my parents warmly, on Eli's behalf, the way you do when you've decided, consciously or not, that raising the issue would cost more socially than absorbing it quietly. The pattern continued in smaller, more granular ways I almost stopped consciously registering, the way you stop registering a hum in a room, after you've lived with it long enough. Birthday party invitations for Bryce and the twins that specified the whole family, while Eli's birthday invitations, sent by me, sometimes received a smaller turnout, a "we'll try to swing by" from my father that occasionally didn't materialize into an actual visit. School events, a preschool graduation for Eli that only my mother attended, versus a similar ceremony for Bryce the following year that both my parents took a half-day off work to attend, complete with a bouquet of flowers and a professional photographer my mother had hired without being asked. I kept a private note about all of this, starting around the time Eli turned 5, not because I'd decided anything dramatic, but because a friend of mine, someone entirely outside my family, had asked me over coffee one afternoon whether Eli got treated the same as his cousins at family things, and I'd found myself unable to answer honestly without actually thinking it through first. I went home that night and, almost as an experiment, wrote down every specific instance I could remember from the previous year. It took me nearly 40 minutes to fill 2 full pages. That note became a running document over the following 2 years, expanded slowly, into something closer to a real record, photographs from family gatherings, time-stamped, showing which children were centered and which were at the edges of the frame, screenshots of texts where Eli's events were mentioned in passing, if at all, compared to detailed, enthusiastic threads about his cousin's milestones. I want to be fair to my parents here, the same way I've tried to be fair to them throughout this story, because I don't think either of them ever consciously decided to treat their grandchildren unequally. My mother, in particular, has always struggled with a kind of social calculus that flows toward whoever is loudest in the room, and Whitney's household, with 3 children instead of 1, generates more noise, more logistics, more opportunities for involvement almost by mathematical default. I understand that dynamic intellectually. It doesn't change what it costs a quiet 7-year-old boy to notice, year after year, that his cousins' names get circled on menus and his doesn't. I remember specifically a conversation I had with my closest friend, Dana, about 18 months before any of this happened, over coffee on a Saturday morning while our kids played at a nearby park. Dana has known me since college, has no stake whatsoever in my family's internal politics, and has always been the person I trust to tell me honestly when I'm being sensitive versus when I'm actually seeing something real. I described, almost offhandedly, a recent family barbecue where Whitney's kids had been given the good seats near the pool, and Eli had ended up at a folding table near the garage with 2 other cousins nobody quite knew what to do with. I expected her to say I was reading too much into seating arrangements at a casual family gathering. Instead, she went quiet for a moment and then said, "You've told me some version of this story probably a dozen times over the last 2 years, and it's always framed like a one-off." I don't think it's a one-off. I didn't fully absorb that conversation at the time. I think, looking back, some part of me needed to hear it several more times, in several more forms, before I was ready to actually act on it. I want to give one more specific example, because I think the accumulation matters more than any single incident, and because this one, in hindsight, was probably the clearest early version of what would eventually happen with the stakes. The spring Eli turned 6, my parents organized a joint graduation celebration for Bryce, who was finishing elementary school that year, and decided, generously, to make it a bigger event, a rented space, a hired photographer, a cake from an actual bakery rather than a grocery store sheet cake. Eli, who was finishing kindergarten that same spring, technically had his own small milestone happening within weeks of Bryce's, a detail my mother acknowledged with a card, and a $20 gift certificate to a bookstore, mailed rather than delivered in person, arriving 4 days after his actual kindergarten graduation had already happened. I didn't say anything about the disparity at the time. I told myself, the way I told myself so many things during those years, that kindergarten graduations weren't really comparable to elementary school graduations anyway, a distinction that felt reasonable in the moment and that I've since come to recognize as exactly the kind of quiet self-talk that lets a pattern keep running unexamined for years. I need to explain the specific tradition that led to that Sunday dinner, because it matters for understanding exactly how deliberate the omission actually was. 3 years ago, my father, newly retired from 31 years running a regional distribution business, discovered a genuine passion for what he calls doing steak dinners right, a hobby that started with him reading about dry aging processes online and turned, gradually, into a standing family tradition. Roughly every 6 weeks, my parents host what they call Grandchild steak night, a full dinner at a high-end steakhouse near their house, where each grandchild gets to order whatever cut they want off the adult menu. My father's small, proud way of making the children feel like honored guests, rather than kids relegated to a separate menu with chicken tenders and a scoop of ice cream. I should tell you, because it's relevant, that the restaurant they use for these dinners, a place called Anders and Wolf, a mid-sized steakhouse specializing in dry-aged beef, happens to be a restaurant my company supplies. Not directly through me personally, but through my company's distribution network, one of roughly 40 restaurants across 3 states that source their aged ribeyes and porterhouses through the vendor relationships I manage professionally. My parents don't fully understand what I do for a living. My mother describes it, when pressed, as something with restaurants, and I had never, until the events of this story, seen any particular reason to explain the overlap in more detail. It simply hadn't come up. Anders and Wolf was my father's discovery, made independently months before I even realized, flipping through a distribution report at my own job, that it was one of our accounts. Eli had, until the dinner in question, always been included in steak night, though I want to be honest that his inclusion had a specific shape to it that I'd noticed and let go, the way I'd let go of so many things. He was seated, most dinners, at the far end of the table, near my father rather than in the cluster of cousins closer to my mother and Whitney. His steak, when he was old enough to order one, was consistently the smallest and least expensive cut on the menu, a choice I'd always assumed was simply his own preference, since Eli genuinely does prefer smaller portions, until the events of this story made me question whether that preference had ever actually been asked for, or whether it had simply been assigned to him early and never revisited. The dinner in question was going to be different, and I understood exactly why the moment I read that group chat message more carefully. It wasn't a routine steak night. It was a celebration dinner, planned specifically to mark Bryce's 10th birthday, Harper and Hudson's 8th birthday, and Camden's 6th birthday, all falling within the same 3-week window that spring, a coincidence my mother had decided to honor with what she called, in a separate, longer message she'd sent only to Whitney and forwarded to me almost as an afterthought, the big one: go big on the cuts, doesn't matter what it costs. These are milestone birthdays. Eli's birthday, I should mention, falls in October, 5 months away from that particular Sunday. There was no birthday of his to combine into the celebration. But there had never been a rule, in 3 years of steak night, that the dinner was only for birthday grandchildren. Every single dinner before this one had included all 6 children, ordering whatever they wanted, regardless of whose birthday it was or wasn't. This dinner, quietly and without any actual announcement, redrew that boundary for the first time, and it redrew it in a way that happened to exclude exactly one child. I called my mother the evening after I saw the group chat photo, and I want to walk you through that conversation carefully, because I think it's the clearest window into how these things happen in families like mine, not through cruelty, but through a kind of practiced, reflexive minimization that makes the person raising the concern feel, by the end of the call, as though they were the one being unreasonable. I noticed Eli's steak wasn't on the list, I said, keeping my voice as level as I could manage. Oh, well, it's really more of a birthday thing this time, honey, my mother said. Bryce and the twins in Camden, it's all their birthdays basically at once, we wanted to make it special for them specifically. Eli's part of the family too, I said. He doesn't need it to be his birthday to be included in a dinner the rest of his cousins are at. Of course he's included, he'll be there, he can order off the regular menu, we're not leaving him out of the dinner, my mother said, and I could hear, underneath the words, the specific tone of someone who genuinely believed she was making a reasonable distinction rather than drawing a line straight through her grandson. It's just, this one's really about celebrating their birthdays specifically. You understand, right? I said I understood, because I have spent most of my life saying I understand things I do not, in fact, understand, in order to keep a conversation from becoming a confrontation. I hung up the phone and sat in my car in my own driveway for several minutes before going inside, because I didn't want Eli to see whatever was on my face in that moment, and because I needed, the way I always seem to need after conversations like that one, a few minutes to feel the actual size of what had just happened before I had to go back to being fine. I want to tell you what I did next, because it's the part of this story that I think actually matters, more than the dinner itself, more than what happened 2 weeks later. I didn't argue with my mother further. I didn't call my father to make my case to him separately, hoping he'd overrule her. I did something quieter, and I think now, something that had been building in me for 3 years without my fully admitting it to myself. I opened the file on my laptop where I'd been keeping loose notes about Eli's treatment, and for the first time, I actually organized it: dates, specific incidents, photographs, the whole accumulated shape of 3 years laid out in a proper timeline, instead of a scattered collection of things I'd been quietly filing away. And then, because of what I do for a living, because I understood something about that particular dinner that nobody else at that table was going to understand, I did one more thing. I pulled up my company's account records for Anders and Wolf. I want to explain, as simply as I can, what those records showed me, because it's the detail that turns this story from an ordinary family slight into something else entirely. Anders and Wolf, like most of the restaurants in my company's network, operates on what's called a preferred vendor arrangement. In exchange for exclusively sourcing their dry-aged beef program through my company, they receive a negotiated discount on a rotating selection of premium cuts, a discount that isn't visible on the menu price the customer actually pays, but that significantly affects the restaurant's own margin on those dishes. It's a completely standard arrangement in the industry, nothing unusual about it on its own. What was unusual, what I found scrolling through an internal account summary 2 days after that phone call with my mother, was a specific line item, a recurring reservation, roughly every 6 weeks for the past 3 years, under my father's name, flagged in the restaurant's own internal notes, visible to me because of my vendor access, not because anyone at the restaurant had done anything wrong, with a note that read, in the restaurant's shorthand, regular VIP, GM comps at plus dessert most. Visits, ref, my last name, family discount extended per standing arrangement. I sat with that for a long moment before I fully understood what I was looking at. What it meant, once I traced it back through the restaurant's own comp logs and cross-referenced it against the vendor discount my company extended to Anders and Wolf specifically, was this: the restaurant's general manager, a man I'd met exactly once, years earlier, at an industry mixer where I'd mentioned in passing that my father was a regular customer there, had quietly extended a small, informal courtesy to my family, an appetizer here, a dessert there, occasionally a modest discount on the total check, specifically because of my professional relationship with the restaurant, a courtesy my father had never once questioned or, I suspected, fully understood the source of. My father believed, as far as I could tell from 3 years of hearing him talk about steak night, that Anders and Wolf simply liked him as a loyal customer. What was actually happening was that a restaurant I had professional influence over had been quietly subsidizing a tradition that, for the past several dinners at least, had been actively excluding my son. I want to be honest about what I felt, reading that account note for the first time. It wasn't triumph, not yet. It was something closer to a very specific, very cold kind of clarity, the recognition that I had, without ever intending to, been professionally connected to my own son's exclusion the entire time, propping up, through channels my family didn't even know existed, the exact tradition that had just quietly erased him from a birthday menu. I sat at my desk for a long time after finding that note, scrolling back through the account's history slowly, the way you'd reread a document a second time to make sure the first read hadn't been a misunderstanding. I pulled up the original email exchange from years earlier, the one where the general manager had first mentioned extending a small courtesy to my father's account, 3 short paragraphs, entirely professional in tone, that I'd apparently glanced at, replied to with a polite thank you, and then filed away in my inbox without ever fully registering what I was agreeing to. I remember feeling a specific kind of embarrassment at that discovery, not because I'd done anything wrong exactly, but because it meant I had been, in some passive, half-conscious way, complicit in exactly the arrangement I was now sitting there being upset about. I hadn't engineered it. But I also hadn't questioned it, for 3 years, the same way I hadn't questioned 100 other small unfairnesses in my family, because questioning things had never felt like it was worth the social cost. I want to describe the specific week between finding that account note and the birthday dinner itself, because I think it matters for understanding how deliberate the rest of this story actually was. I didn't rush into anything. I spent 2 full evenings, after Eli was asleep, going through the comp history line by line, cross-referencing dates against my own family's group chat, matching each discounted dinner to the corresponding thread where my mother had posted photos of the food, the cake, the celebration, building, essentially, a second ledger to sit alongside the one I'd already been keeping about Eli's treatment, except this one was denominated in dollars instead of moments, and dollars, I've found, are a language nobody in my family has ever quite known how to argue with. I didn't say anything to anyone for the first week after finding that account note. I want to walk you through what I actually did during that week, because I think the specifics matter more than the summary. I requested, through entirely normal internal channels at my job, a full comp history for the Anders and Wolf account going back 3 years, not because I was planning some dramatic reveal at that point, but because the analyst in me, the part of me that reads loan covenants and vendor contracts for a living, needed to actually understand the full shape of what I'd stumbled into before I decided what to do with it. What I found, laid out in an ordinary spreadsheet that took me about 90 minutes to properly review, was this: over 3 years, across roughly 22 separate steak night dinners, Anders and Wolf had extended my family a combination of comped appetizers, comped desserts, and a standing 10% discount on the total check, all traceable to that single informal note from the general manager years earlier, a total value, once I added it up, of just over $6,100. In complimentary food and discounts my family had received without ever knowing why, or that it was connected to me at all. I sat with that number for a long time. $6,100 is not, in the scheme of things, a life-changing amount of money. That wasn't the part that mattered to me. What mattered was the shape of it, that for 3 years, my professional relationships, built on my own work, my own expertise, the part of my life my family had never once shown much curiosity about beyond something with restaurants, had been quietly making it easier, cheaper, more comfortable for my family to host a tradition my son was now, for the first time in its history, being explicitly excluded from. I thought, for several days, about simply calling the general manager and asking him to end the arrangement, not out of spite, but because something about my company's discount quietly subsidizing my own son's exclusion felt, once I understood it clearly, like something I couldn't continue to let happen without at least acknowledging it to myself. But I also knew, the analyst in me knew, that simply pulling the arrangement without explanation would look, to my family, like an unrelated inconvenience, a restaurant policy change, nothing they'd ever connect back to the dinner or to Eli at all. If I wanted this to actually mean something, if I wanted my family to understand the shape of what they'd built without ever examining it, I needed them to see the whole picture at once, the way I'd finally seen it myself, sitting alone with a spreadsheet on a Tuesday night. So I waited. I went to the steak night dinner that Sunday, the one with 5 circled steaks and Eli's name missing from the list, and I want to describe what that evening actually looked like, because I think it's important to understand exactly what my son experienced in specific, concrete terms, rather than in the abstract. We arrived on time, the 6 of us plus Whitney's family and my parents, 11 people at a long table near the back of the restaurant, that I now understood, with a clarity I hadn't had 3 years earlier. My family had been receiving preferential seating arranged by staff who recognized the account note attached to my father's reservation. Bryce ordered the 42-ounce tomahawk, a cut that runs $128 on the menu, and the table applauded when it arrived, a server carrying it out on a wooden board with visible ceremony, my father beaming with the specific pride of a man delighted by his own generosity. The twins split a ribeye for two, $64 per person, with a side of truffle fries my mother had preemptively ordered for the whole table to share. Camden, 6 years old, ordered a New York strip that came to $91, more food than I genuinely believe a 6-year-old could eat, though nobody at that table seemed to register that as strange. Eli ordered off the regular menu, the one without the celebratory ceremony, a grilled chicken breast that cost $14, and I watched him do it without complaint, in the quiet, accommodating way he'd apparently learned at 7 years old from watching how these dinners went for 3 years running. He didn't ask why his cousins' plates looked different from his. He didn't say anything at all, actually, which I think was the detail that finally, fully hardened something in me that had been softening and re-softening for 3 years every time I talked myself into believing the next dinner would be different. At one point during that dinner, my father stood up to give a small toast, nothing elaborate, just a few sentences about how proud he was of these 4 incredible kids, turning another year older, raising his glass to Bryce, Harper, Hudson, and Camden by name, one at a time, each name met with a round of applause from the table. He did not mention Eli. I don't think it was intentional, in the sense of a conscious decision made in that specific moment. The toast was built entirely around the birthday framing, and Eli, having no birthday to attach to that particular dinner, simply had no obvious slot in the sentence my father had prepared. But I watched my son sit through that toast, watched him clap along for his cousins with what looked, from the outside, like genuine warmth, and I understood, watching him do it so smoothly, so practiced, that this wasn't the first time he'd learned to make himself small at a table that had decided, without ever saying so, how much room he was allowed to take up. I didn't say anything at the dinner itself. I want to be honest about why, because I think it's an important part of this story. I had already decided, sitting in my car after that phone call with my mother a week earlier, that whatever I did about this, it wasn't going to be a scene at a restaurant table in front of my parents, my sister, and 5 children, only one of whom would fully understand what was actually happening. I wanted this handled the way I handle everything in my professional life, with the full picture assembled first, presented calmly, in a setting where nobody could dismiss it as an overreaction to a single dinner. I drove home that night with Eli asleep in his booster seat in the back, and somewhere on that drive, the same quiet, undramatic way I seem to make every real decision in my life, I finished making up my mind about what I was going to do. The following Monday, I called the general manager at Anders & Wolf directly, not to complain, not to make a scene, but simply, professionally, to ask a few clarifying questions about the standing courtesy arrangement attached to my father's account, questions I was entitled to ask as the vendor relationship manager whose company's discount had made the arrangement possible in the first place. He was, if anything, glad to hear from me. He mentioned, warmly, how much he appreciated our company's product, how loyal a customer my father had become, how he hoped the family enjoyed the little extras he'd been able to extend over the years as a professional courtesy, given the relationship. I asked him one specific question, framed as neutrally as I could manage. Going forward, could the family's account simply be treated the same as any other customers, full price, no complimentary items, no discount, not because of any problem with the restaurant or with him personally, but because I'd decided, for reasons of my own, that I no longer wanted my professional relationships subsidizing family arrangements I had no visibility into. He agreed without hesitation, a little confused but entirely professional about it, and told me the change would take effect immediately, starting with whatever the next reservation happened to be. I didn't tell my family what I'd done. I want to be precise about that, because it's the detail that makes the next 2 weeks feel, in hindsight, less like a scheme, and more like simply allowing a fact to surface on its own timeline. I didn't sabotage anything. I didn't call ahead to warn the restaurant to be difficult, didn't ask for worse service, didn't do anything except restore an ordinary business relationship to its ordinary, non-discounted terms. What happened next happened entirely because of decisions other people had already made, running headlong into a subsidy that, for the first time in 3 years, was no longer there to soften the landing. The next steak night fell exactly 2 weeks after the birthday dinner, a Sunday my parents had, coincidentally, decided to make even bigger than the one before, since my mother had mentioned in the group chat that she wanted to keep the celebration going with a follow-up dinner for extended family, my aunt, my uncle, 2 cousins visiting from out of state, bringing the total party size that evening to 19 people, including all 6 grandchildren, Eli among them this time, since there was no birthday framing left to exclude him from. I want to tell you what happened at that dinner secondhand, because I wasn't there. Eli and I had a prior commitment that Sunday, a decision I'd made weeks earlier that had nothing to do with anything I'd set in motion, though the timing, in hindsight, feels almost too neat to be believed. I heard about it afterward from my mother, in a phone call the following Monday that started, unusually for her, without any small talk at all. The bill, for 19 people, most of them ordering off the premium steak menu the way the family had grown accustomed to doing at Anders and Wolf over 3 years of comped appetizers and quiet discounts, came to just over $1,800, full price, no complimentary bread service, no discounted dessert course, no 10% courtesy reduction. My family had never known to expect as anything other than the restaurant's ordinary pricing. My father, according to my mother, stared at the check for what she described as a really long, uncomfortable minute, before quietly asking the server if there'd been some kind of mistake, since previous visits had always come out lower than this. The server knew enough to the restaurant that she didn't have the full history of the account, simply told him the total reflected the menu as priced, apologized for any confusion, and offered to get a manager if he'd like, which he did. The general manager came to the table, the same one I'd spoken with days earlier, and explained, politely and without any particular drama, that the account's standing courtesy arrangement had been discontinued per a request from the vendor contact on file, a detail he mentioned, my mother told me, like it was supposed to mean something to us, and none of us had any idea what he was talking about. My father paid the bill. Of course he paid it. There was no scene, no confrontation, nothing dramatic happened at that table at all, which I think is actually the most honest part of this story. What happened was smaller and in its own way, more revealing. An $1,800 dinner, for a family that had spent 3 years believing their generosity toward their grandchildren cost meaningfully less than it actually did, arrived, for the first time, at its real price, on the same night my father had specifically wanted to make the celebration bigger rather than smaller. My mother described the rest of the evening to me in more detail during that Monday phone call, and I want to include some of it here, because I think it fills in a part of the picture I wasn't there to witness firsthand. She said my father grew quiet for the remainder of the meal, doing what she described as his math face, a phrase I recognized instantly from childhood, the specific expression he gets when he's silently recalculating something he thought he already understood. My aunt, visiting from out of state and unaware of any of the history behind the discount, apparently made an offhand comment about how reasonable the prices seemed for a restaurant of that caliber, not realizing she was looking at the bill for the first time without any of the courtesies the family had grown quietly accustomed to receiving. My uncle, apparently, joked that they should come back more often since it was worth every penny, a comment my mother said landed strangely in the silence that followed, because everyone at the table who'd been coming for the past 3 years understood, on some inarticulate level, that something about the evening felt different, even before the general manager had explained why. Eli's father, who had been informed of the situation only after the fact, mentioned to me later that week that he wished I'd told him what I'd found before the dinner happened, not out of any objection to what I'd done, but because he said he would have liked the chance to simply ask Eli, gently, how the earlier birthday dinner had actually felt from the inside, before I'd built an entire case around it on his behalf. It was a fair point, and one I sat with for a while. I did eventually ask Eli directly, a few days after that phone call with my mother, in the careful, low-pressure way you ask a 7-year-old about something you suspect might be sitting heavier on him than he has the words for yet. He shrugged in the specific way he shrugs when he's decided a topic isn't worth making a fuss about and said, "It's fine, Mom. I don't really like the big stakes anyway." I believed him, in the sense that I don't think he was lying. I also understood, hearing it, that a 7-year-old learning to genuinely prefer the smaller, cheaper option, rather than simply accepting it because it's what's offered, is its own quiet kind of cost, one that doesn't show up on any restaurant bill at all. My mother's phone call the next day wasn't an accusation, not at first. She was confused, mostly, turning over the mention of a vendor contact on file, the way you turn over an unfamiliar phrase, trying to make it fit somewhere in a story that had never included it before. "Do you know anything about this?" she asked. The manager said something about a vendor request. "You work with restaurants, right? Would you know why they'd suddenly change something like that?" I want to describe the moment I decided to actually tell her, because I think it's the true center of this story, more than the dinner, more than the discovery, more even than the bill itself. I had a version of this conversation available to me where I simply said I didn't know anything about it, let the mystery dissolve into an unexplained restaurant policy change, and moved on with my life the way I'd moved on from 100 smaller slights before this one. Some tired, familiar part of me actually reached for that option first, out of habit more than conviction. But I thought about Eli at that dinner 2 weeks earlier, ordering a $14 chicken breast while his cousins were served a tomahawk steak on a wooden board with applause, sitting through a toast that used for names and skipped his, doing it all with the quiet, practiced accommodation of a child who has learned exactly how much space he's allowed to take up at his own family's table. And I decided, standing in my kitchen with the phone against my ear, the same kitchen where this whole story had started with a photo of 5 circled steaks, that I was done letting that mystery dissolve quietly, the way every mystery in my family always seemed to dissolve, without anyone ever having to actually look at it directly. "I know exactly why," I said. "I'm the vendor contact on file. I have been for 3 years, since before you ever found that restaurant. The discount you've been getting the entire time you've been hosting steak night, the comp desserts, the 10% off the check, all of it, has been running through my company's account, connected to my job, because a manager I met once, years ago, decided to extend a courtesy to my family because of my professional relationship with the restaurant. I found out 2 weeks ago, the same week Eli's name wasn't on that birthday dinner list, and I made a decision that I wasn't going to keep quietly subsidizing a tradition that had just, for the first time in 3 years, decided my son wasn't worth including." There was a long silence on the phone, long enough that I genuinely wondered, for a moment, if the call had dropped. When my mother finally spoke, her voice had a texture I'd rarely heard from her, not defensive, not yet, just profoundly unmoored, the sound of someone confronting a fact that didn't fit anywhere in the story she'd been telling herself about her own family. "You paid for our steak dinners," she said, slowly, like she was trying the sentence out to see if it made sense. "This whole time." "I didn't pay for them directly," I said, wanting to be precise, because precision has always been the thing I trust most when everything else in a conversation feels uncertain. "But my work made them cheaper than they should have been, every single time, without any of you knowing it, and without me ever being asked whether I wanted that arrangement to exist in the first place. I found out about it by accident, looking into something else entirely. And once I understood what it was, I couldn't keep looking at it without also looking at what happened 2 weeks ago, at the dinner where Eli's name wasn't on the list." I told her then, calmly, without raising my voice, everything I'd found, the 3 years of comps and discounts, the specific dollar figure, just over $6,100 in courtesies my family had received without ever knowing to be grateful for the right reason, and the fact that I had ended the arrangement myself, deliberately, the week after that birthday dinner, not as a punishment, but because I genuinely could not continue to let my own professional life quietly make it easier for my family to host a tradition that had just excluded my son for the first time in its 3-year history. My mother didn't say much for the rest of that call. She asked, near the end, in a smaller voice than I'd heard from her in years, whether I was angry, genuinely angry, the kind she'd have to do something about, rather than the quieter, more manageable kind of upset she'd apparently grown used to absorbing from me without much consequence. I told her the truth. I wasn't interested in being angry at her specifically. I was interested in whether anyone in that family was capable of actually seeing the pattern, now that it had a dollar figure attached to it, and an $1,800 bill to make the abstraction concrete. The actual family conversation, the one that mattered, the one where something finally shifted, happened the following weekend, at my parents' house, not at a restaurant this time, over a meal my mother had cooked herself, the same house where the very first version of this pattern had quietly taken root years earlier without anyone examining it. Whitney was there. My father was there. I brought the same kind of documentation I'd started keeping 3 years earlier, though I want to be clear that I didn't bring it as a weapon. I brought it because I'd learned, over 3 years of watching things get minimized in real time, that vague feelings are easy to dismiss and specific dates are not. I laid it out plainly, the way I'd laid out a ledger for 100 different professional negotiations before this one, 3 years of steak night dinners, the specific pattern of which grandchildren got the premium cuts and the applause and which one consistently got the smallest, least expensive option, the toast 2 weeks earlier that named for cousins and skipped a fifth. The $6,100 in comps and discounts my company's relationship had quietly provided the entire time, without any of them ever knowing where it came from or that it existed at all, and the $1,800 bill that had finally, for one dinner, shown my family what the tradition actually cost without me standing quietly behind it. My father was the one who spoke first, and what he said surprised me more than anything my mother had said on the phone. "I never once thought about what Eli was ordering," he said. I don't know what I thought. I think I thought since it wasn't his birthday, it made sense he'd just get something normal off the menu, and I never really looked at what something normal actually meant next to what his cousins were getting. He was quiet for a moment, turning his water glass slowly on the table the way I remembered him doing when he was working through something difficult. "I've been so focused on making it special for Whitney's kids, because there's 3 of them, because it feels like there's more to celebrate at once, that I don't think I ever noticed I was making the exact same dinner feel smaller for the one kid who's always just quietly there." Whitney, to her credit, didn't get defensive, though I want to be honest that there was a version of this conversation where she could have. She said instead, something I think about often since, that she'd noticed, at more than one steak night over the years, that Eli's order always seemed to come out faster and smaller than her kids', and that she'd told herself it was simply because he was a lighter eater, a story that was comfortable enough to believe that she'd never once asked him, or me, whether it was actually true. "I don't think I wanted to know," she said. "It was easier to think it was just how he liked it." I told them all plainly, what I'd already told my mother on the phone, that I hadn't ended the discount to punish anyone, and that I had no interest in it being reinstated, because I'd realized, sitting with that spreadsheet 2 weeks earlier, that I no longer wanted any part of my professional life quietly propping up a family tradition I had no say in shaping. If steak night continued, I said, it was going to continue at its real price, paid for honestly by whoever was hosting it, and every grandchild at that table was going to order whatever cut they wanted, every single time, regardless of whose birthday it was or wasn't. Nobody argued with me. I think, more than anything, my family was still absorbing the fact that the quiet one, the one who worked something with restaurants, that nobody had ever asked a real question about, had been sitting on both the means and the information to make this pattern visible the entire time, and simply hadn't chosen to, until the exact moment a menu with 5 circled steaks made the choice for her. There was a specific moment near the end of that conversation, after most of the hard part had passed, and we'd moved into something closer to an actual, practical discussion about how future dinners would work, when my mother asked whether I'd let her know if I ever needed help with something, real help, financial or otherwise, instead of quietly absorbing costs the way she now understood I'd apparently been doing, in one form or another, for years. I didn't have a clean answer for her in the moment. I told her the truth, which was that I honestly didn't know yet whether I fully trusted that offer, not because I doubted her sincerity in that specific instance, but because trust, in a family like mine, isn't rebuilt in a single conversation no matter how honest that conversation manages to be. She nodded and didn't push the point further, which I noticed, and which I think mattered more than if she'd tried to convince me on the spot. My father asked one more question before we left the table that evening, quieter than anything else he'd said. He asked whether I'd known, the whole time I was managing that account professionally, that the courtesy was connected to our family specifically, or whether I'd simply stumbled onto it by accident the same week as the birthday dinner. I told him the truth. I hadn't known, not really, not in any way I'd consciously registered, until I went looking for something else entirely and found it sitting there, 3 years old, quietly running in the background the whole time. I told him I didn't think that mattered as much as what I'd done once I did know, that the actual decision, the one that counted, wasn't about when I'd learned the arrangement existed, but about what I chose to do in the 2 weeks after I finally understood the shape of it. It's been about 4 months since that conversation, and I want to be honest that nothing about it produced some instant, total transformation. That isn't how families actually work, and I've never wanted to tell this story as though it does. What changed in the weeks and months since was smaller and I think more durable than a single confrontation. The next steak night, 6 weeks later, every single grandchild ordered whatever they wanted, full price, no distinctions drawn between whose birthday it was or wasn't. Eli ordered a filet, medium, with the same quiet confidence his cousins had always been allowed to have without earning it first, and I watched my father specifically ask him, unprompted, how he wanted it cooked, a small, ordinary question that had simply never been asked of him before in 3 years of these dinners. My father, in particular, has made a specific, visible effort I hadn't expected from him. He calls Eli now, roughly once every couple of weeks, just to talk about nothing in particular, a video game Eli's been playing, a book he's reading for school, conversations that have no obvious purpose beyond simply making sure my son understands in the accumulated weight of small, unremarkable gestures, that he's being actively thought about rather than just occasionally remembered when there's a birthday attached to justify it. I still work with restaurants for a living, and I still, on occasion, drive past Anders and Wolf on my way to other accounts, though my family hosts steak night there less frequently now, since the honest price of it has made my parents a little more thoughtful about how often they can reasonably host 19 people for premium steak dinners. I don't think that's a bad thing. I think, if anything, the tradition means more now that it costs what it actually costs, and that every child at that table is included in it on the same terms, rather than some children receiving it as an obvious birthright, and one quietly having to earn a smaller version of it every single time. People sometimes ask, when I tell parts of this story, whether I regret pulling that discount, whether it felt, in the end, like using my job to punish my own family rather than simply having the difficult conversation directly. I understand the question, but I don't think that's quite what happened. I didn't end that courtesy arrangement to punish anyone. I ended it because I couldn't, in good conscience, keep letting my professional life quietly make it easier for a tradition to run exactly the way it had been running, a tradition that had just, for the first time in its history, decided my son wasn't worth including in its most generous version. The $1,800 bill wasn't a trap I set. It was simply what the dinner had always actually cost, arriving, for the first time, without me standing quietly behind it to soften the number. If there's a lesson in any of this, I don't think it's about restaurants, or discounts, or even, really, about steak. I think it's about the specific, quiet cost of being the family member whose contributions go unexamined for long enough that they start to feel invisible even to the person making them. I had been subsidizing a tradition my own son was being excluded from, without ever fully realizing it, for 3 years, because nobody in my family had ever thought to ask what something with restaurants actually meant, and I had never thought to explain it, because explaining it had simply never felt necessary until the exact moment it very much was. Eli is 7 years old, and he doesn't fully understand the mechanics of vendor discounts or comped appetizers, and I don't think he needs to. What he understands, now, is simpler than that his name gets circled on the menu the same as everyone else's, every single time, without needing a birthday to earn it. That's the only part of this story that actually mattered to me in the end. The rest of it, the spreadsheet, the $6,100, the $1,800 bill that finally made an old pattern visible in numbers nobody could argue with, was just the paperwork it took to get there. I think often, still, about the moment my father asked to see Eli's order come out first at that following steak night, a small logistical request he made to the server without any fanfare, simply so his grandson wouldn't be the last one at the table still waiting for food while everyone else had already started eating, a detail so small I almost didn't notice it happening, except that I'd spent 3 years noticing exactly the opposite pattern, and the absence of it, for the first time, felt like its own kind of proof. My father has never been a man who explains himself well out loud, and I don't think he ever will be. But I've learned, over these past few months, to read the small, practical gestures as their own form of language, the only one he's ever really been fluent in, and by that measure, he has said more to Eli in the last 4 months than in the 3 years before it. Whitney and I talk more now, too, in a way I hadn't expected out of any of this. She called me, unprompted, about 6 weeks after that kitchen table conversation, to tell me she'd started noticing the same pattern in smaller places she'd never thought to examine before, a school pickup rotation that always seemed to prioritize her kids' schedules over Eli's, a group photo from a family reunion 2 years earlier where her 3 children were front and center and Eli was cropped nearly out of frame at the edge. She said she felt sick looking back through old photos with that specific pattern finally visible to her, the way you feel sick noticing a structural crack in a house you've lived in for years without ever looking up. I told her I didn't need her to feel sick about it. I needed her, going forward, to simply notice, the way I'd finally learned to notice, before the pattern had a chance to calcify into something none of us examined again. I want to be honest that there are still moments, even now, where an old habit surfaces without anyone quite meaning it to. A group chat photo where Bryce's soccer trophy gets 3 enthusiastic replies before anyone comments on the school assembly award Eli brought home that same week, a holiday gift that's slightly more generous for one cousin than another for reasons nobody can quite articulate. I don't expect perfection from a family that spent years operating inside a pattern nobody had ever been forced to name out loud. What I expect now, and what I mostly receive, is correction, the visible, if imperfect, effort of people actively trying to catch themselves, rather than the old, comfortable silence that simply let the imbalance run without comment. I still work with restaurants for a living, and my job hasn't changed in any of the ways that matter to my actual career. I still manage the same accounts, still negotiate the same kinds of vendor arrangements, still spend my days thinking about margins and distribution and the granular economics of how a good steak gets from a ranch to a table. What changed is smaller and more personal than any of that. I no longer let any part of my professional life quietly absorb costs on my family's behalf without at least understanding, clearly, what it's actually subsidizing. If I extend a courtesy now to anyone, it's because I've decided to on purpose, with my eyes open, not because a manager I met once years ago decided on my behalf that it was the kind of thing I'd probably want. People sometimes ask, too, whether I worry the discount will quietly find its way back someday, once enough time has passed and the memory of that $1,800 bill has softened into something easier to forget. I've thought about that more than I expected to. But I think the actual protection was never really the discount itself, or the absence of it. The protection is that my family now knows, in specific, undeniable numbers, exactly what generosity costs when it's real, and exactly how easily generosity can quietly become uneven when nobody's paying close enough attention to notice who it's actually reaching. That knowledge doesn't disappear just because a restaurant policy might someday change again. It sits there now, the way a fact sits once you've finally been forced to look directly at it, available to any of us the next time an old habit tries to reassert itself without anyone examining it first. You don't have to raise your voice to change the terms of your own family. Sometimes you just have to stop quietly paying, in every sense of that word, for a tradition that was never actually including everyone it claimed to. I still think, sometimes, about that first group chat photo, 5 circled steaks, a caption about spoiling these babies, and my son's name simply missing, the way an omission can sit right there in plain sight for weeks before anyone with the right information is willing to trace it back to its actual cost. I don't think my family will ever fully understand every layer of what that omission set in motion. I'm not sure they need to. What matters in the end is smaller than the whole complicated shape of it. A 7-year-old boy, ordering whatever he wants off a menu now, without needing a birthday, or an apology, or a spreadsheet to earn the right to ask for it. If this story meant something to you, tell me in the comments where you'd have drawn your own line, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories like this one every week.